Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are going to spend some quiet time with the temples of Egypt, those ancient places where stone, sunlight, ritual and memory came together. We will move slowly through their courts and sanctuaries, their carved walls and painted ceilings, their offerings, processions and long histories. These were not only monuments, they were living places in their own time, filled with movement, fragrance, voice and devotion. If you enjoy these calm journeys through the ancient world, you are very welcome to like the video, subscribe, or leave a gentle comment if you feel like it. Perhaps you could share where you are listening from tonight, or mention another peaceful topic you would like to hear next. For now, settle in and let the room grow softer around you. Let the day drift away. Imagine the warm stone of a temple wall after sunset, the hush of a sacred corridor, and the quiet echo of a world that has been sleeping for a very long time. And as we begin, we will simply take our time and explore these temples one by one, in a calm unfolding of details, history, and the slow atmosphere of ancient Egypt. The temples of Egypt were not built as quiet decorative monuments, even though they often feel silent to us now. In the ancient world, they were active sacred spaces where gods were believed to dwell in image, ritual, and presence. A temple could be understood as a carefully maintained home for a deity, a place where order was renewed through offerings, prayers, and ceremonial movement. This is one reason Egyptian temples were usually designed with a strong sense of progression. The public entered spaces that gradually became more restricted, more sacred, and more controlled. The farther one moved inward, the closer one came to the divine center. In many cases, the temple was not simply one building, but a sequence of thresholds, each one marking a quieter and more intimate level of contact with the sacred. Courtyards opened to the sky, halls grew darker and denser with columns, and inner sanctuaries became smaller still, until only priests, and sometimes only the king acting in priestly form, could approach the image of the god. To modern eyes, these spaces can seem monumental and still, yet they were once animated by movement, chant, incense, and the daily rhythm of ritual care. The stone walls held that activity in place. Even now, the arrangement of spaces can suggest a slow inward breathing, as though the architecture itself were inviting the visitor to move from the ordinary world into something more protected, more hushed, and more carefully ordered. Many Egyptian temples were aligned with the world around them in deliberate ways. Their axes could face the rising sun, the course of a river, or important astronomical events. Light itself became part of the temple experience. At certain times of year, a shaft of sunlight might reach into a shrine, illuminating a god's image with precision. The Egyptians observed the sky carefully, and temple architecture often reflected that attention. This was not merely practical orientation, but a way of tying sacred buildings to cosmic patterns that seemed to repeat with reassuring regularity. Sunrise, sunset, the turning of seasons, and the appearance of certain stars all carried meaning. A temple aligned to the horizon could make the daily arrival of light feel like a ceremonial act. In a land where the sun was so central to life, light entering a temple could seem to transform the building for a brief moment, as if the heavens had gently opened a door. Scholars still debate some of these alignments site by site, because ancient builders may have considered multiple layers of meaning at once: religious symbolism, topography, and practical planning. Yet the overall impression remains clear. Egyptian temples were not isolated from nature, but carefully positioned within it, as though they belonged to a larger pattern that linked earth, sky, and divine presence. The earliest temples were built from materials like mud brick and reeds, which meant that many have not survived well. The monumental stone temples we know best are only part of the larger history. They represent an advanced stage of a tradition that was older, broader, and far more varied than the remains alone can show. Long before the great sandstone and limestone sanctuaries were raised in their lasting forms, sacred places may have begun as simpler enclosures, protected spaces made from materials that could be renewed or replaced. Mud brick was common in Egypt for homes, administrative buildings, and many early religious structures because it was available and workable. Reeds and timber may have framed roofs or screens, creating spaces that were lighter, more temporary, and more vulnerable to time. This means that some of the earliest religious architecture has vanished almost completely, leaving only traces in foundation lines, inscriptions, or later echoes. What survives today can therefore give the impression that temple building always aimed at monumental permanence, when in fact the tradition was layered and evolving. The stone temples that still stand were often the culmination of long experimentation, and they may preserve the memory of buildings that once looked very different, perhaps more organic, more seasonal, and more closely tied to the materials of river life. As the Stone Age of Egyptian temple building developed, the walls themselves became storytellers. Reliefs recorded festivals, offerings, royal victories, and sacred myths. A temple was therefore both a religious machine and a memory system, preserving what a culture wished to keep alive. In the dim spaces of a hypostyle hall or along a sunlit outer wall, scenes were carved in careful sequence so that a visitor might encounter not only divine images, but also narratives of legitimacy, piety, and cosmic balance. Kings appeared making offerings to gods, receiving life and authority in return. Priests carried ritual objects, while processions marked important feast days and seasonal observances. Battle scenes sometimes appeared too, linking temple power with the protection of the land. Yet these were not simply decorations in the modern sense. They worked as visual affirmations, helping to renew relationships between ruler, deity, and community. Even when the meaning of a particular scene is debated by scholars, the overall purpose is clear. The walls kept sacred action visible. They turned the temple into a place where memory was not passive, but performed again and again through image, inscription, and repeated ritual language. In this way, the temple was both a building and a record, a place where belief was made durable in stone. Egyptian temples also changed over time. They were expanded, repaired, re-engraved, and sometimes repurposed by later rulers. A single site might carry the marks of many centuries, with each generation adding its own layer to the sacred landscape. That long continuity is part of what makes them so compelling. They were never frozen in one moment. They were alive for centuries, and their stillness now is only the final layer of a much busier past. A modest shrine might grow into a vast complex as kings sought to honor a local god or connect their reign to older traditions. Walls could be extended, pylons added, courtyards widened, and inscriptions updated to reflect new political realities. In some cases, later rulers carefully preserved earlier monuments while claiming them for themselves. In others, they altered or rebuilt them according to changing religious needs. This means that Egyptian temples often contain multiple historical voices in one place. A carving from one dynasty may sit beside a doorway from another, while an inscription remembers a priest, a king, or a feast that no longer survives elsewhere. The result is not neatness, but continuity. Egyptian sacred architecture feels layered because it truly was layered, with each repair or expansion becoming part of the temple's living history. For many temples, the outermost spaces were the most accessible, while the inner rooms became increasingly restricted. This gradual narrowing was important to the emotional life of the building. The temple did not offer a single simple threshold into holiness. Instead, it drew the visitor through a measured sequence of spaces, each one quieter than the last. Courtyards could hold public ceremonies and receive sunlight openly, but deeper chambers often became shaded and cool, their floor levels, roof heights, and column arrangements subtly changing the pace of movement. The experience could feel almost like entering a different climate. Sound would soften, air might become still. The architecture encouraged reverence not through sudden spectacle alone, but through gentle transition. Some scholars have described this as a controlled choreography of access, where stone and space organized religious behavior as much as priests did. It is easy to imagine the effect at dawn or dusk, when shifting light struck pylons, columns, and doorways at low angles, making the temple seem at once solid and changing. The building was not just viewed, it was approached, passed through, and gradually understood. The daily care of a temple mattered as much as its grand ceremonies. In traditional Egyptian thought, a god's image was not merely symbolic. It was treated as a living presence that required food, cleansing, clothing, and protection. Priests washed the sanctuary floor, presented offerings, and made gestures of awakening or honoring the deity. These acts were repeated with steady regularity, and their repetition mattered. They helped preserve Ma'at, the idea of right order, balance, and truth that was central to Egyptian religious thought. In this sense, the temple was a place where cosmic stability was maintained through small, deliberate acts. A loaf of bread, a vessel of water, a plume of incense, or a carefully spoken formula could all belong to that larger maintenance of order. To outsiders, such rituals might have appeared hidden or highly formal, yet to the Egyptians they were part of the essential work of the world. The temple did not simply represent divine order, it participated in it. This may be one reason the buildings were kept so carefully over long periods, often with extensive attention to repair. A sacred house, after all, needed to remain worthy of the being who was thought to dwell within it. Because temples were tied to living cults, they also had economic and administrative functions. Land, labor, grain, animals, and artisans could all be connected to a temple's operations. In larger centers, the temple was not only a spiritual institution, but a major part of local life, influencing employment, storage, distribution, and record keeping. Gifts given to the deity could support priests and workers, while estates attached to the temple helped sustain its daily rituals. This practical side of temple life is important because it reminds us that religion in ancient Egypt was not separate from the rest of society. It was woven into daily structures of production and authority. The temple depended on resources, and in turn it helped organize those resources in sacred terms. Administrative documents from later periods show how deeply temples could be involved in property and personnel, though the details vary from place to place and era to era. Even when the surviving evidence is incomplete, the broader picture suggests a complex institution. The temple was both shrine and center, a place where devotion, management, and prestige often met beneath the same stone roof. Many temples were dedicated to specific gods, but they were also deeply tied to local landscapes and communities. A god's presence in one city might feel distinct from that same deity's presence elsewhere, because sacred identity in Egypt was often shaped by place. Rivers, cliffs, desert edges, and agricultural land could all influence the character of a temple site. Some shrines stood near older cult centers with long memories of devotion, while others grew beside new political capitals or along routes chosen for ceremonial processions. This gave Egyptian temple geography a quiet richness. The same divine name might travel, but each temple could develop its own habits, festivals, and visual language. There was often a balance between shared tradition and local emphasis, and that balance could shift over time. A temple might become famous for one particular god, then later be associated with a broader divine family or a state cult. Such changes were not always abrupt. They could happen gradually, as rulers, priests, and communities adapted to new circumstances. The surviving remains preserve only a part of this subtle process, but they still suggest that Egyptian temples were rooted not only in belief, but also in specific places that mattered to the people who lived nearby. The soundscape of a temple is easy to imagine, even though it is rarely preserved in the ruins themselves. There would have been footsteps on stone floors, the soft movement of linen garments, the murmur of recited formulas, and perhaps the faint crackle of incense or flame. In processions, music may have accompanied sacred images as they were carried through courtyards or into festival routes outside the main enclosure. Sistrums, drums, and voices could have transformed the temple grounds during special occasions, while ordinary days might have felt much quieter, with only the measured activity of ritual staff maintaining the space. Archaeology can suggest layout and function, but the atmosphere of a living temple must be imagined through fragments of text, relief, and comparison with ritual practice. That uncertainty is part of the fascination. We can see enough to know that these places were highly organized, yet not so much that the buildings lose their mystery. In the stillness of their remaining stones, there is room to sense the layers of sound that once filled them, like echoes held very far back in time. Over centuries, Egyptian temples became powerful markers of continuity, even as dynasties changed and foreign rulers came and went. Some later kings restored older sanctuaries to show respect for tradition, while others adopted Egyptian forms as a way of joining the long sacred history of the land. In this way, temples became places where identity could be claimed through preservation as much as through innovation. Their walls could speak of continuity across political shifts, suggesting that divine order outlasted human rule. Yet they also reveal adaptation, compromise, and practical change. A temple that began in one era could still be active in another, though perhaps with different ceremonies or altered meanings. This long life gave Egyptian temples a remarkable depth. They were not only built to impress the present moment, they were built to endure across generations, accumulating memory with every repair and inscription. That is why they can feel so deeply atmospheric today. Their calm is not emptiness. It is the patient result of centuries of use, reverence, damage, renewal, and silence, resting together in one enduring place. The word we translate as temple can cover many different sacred forms in Egypt, because not every holy place functioned exactly the same way. Some were enormous stone complexes built by kings and maintained by the state. Others were modest neighborhood shrines, desert sanctuaries, chapels for a local deity, or holy places attached to a rock, a tree, a spring, or a hill that had long been treated with reverence. In the Egyptian world, sacred space was not always separated neatly from everyday space. A place might become holy because of an ancient story, a burial, a vision, a natural feature, or repeated ritual attention over generations. The result was a landscape full of overlapping meanings, where one sanctuary could stand near another and both could belong to different layers of devotion. Temples were only one part of this larger sacred geography, though they were among its most durable and carefully built expressions. Large temples were usually organized around an outer approach, an open court, and one or more halls that grew darker as one moved inward. This gradual change in light seems to have mattered deeply. The visitor passed from the brightness of the desert or the courtyard into spaces that were increasingly enclosed, solemn, and quiet. Hypostyle halls with many columns supporting high roofs created a forest-like interior where light came in filtered bands. The experience would have been partly visual and partly bodily, since the scale of the place changed with each step. In an age without electric light, that slow transition from sunlit openness to cool shadow would have been especially powerful. The temple was not just seen, it was entered, and its architecture gently guided the senses toward a more concentrated form of attention. The columns themselves were often shaped like papyrus, lotus, or palm stalks, linking architecture to the riverine world of Egypt. These were not random decorative choices. The plants of the Nile Valley carried layers of meaning because they belonged to the rhythms of flood, growth, and renewal that made life possible. Papyrus suggested marshland and fresh vitality. Lotus flowers opened and closed with the sun, which made them easy to connect with rebirth and cyclical time. Palms were associated with endurance, abundance, and the measured passage of the year. When a person walked among those columns, they were moving through an architecture that echoed the natural world in stylized form, as though the temple had gathered the landscape into a controlled and sacred pattern. Temple ceilings were often painted dark blue or deep stone colors and decorated with stars, birds, or protective figures. The effect suggested a sacred cosmos overhead, as if the temple interior had become a miniature universe. This was not merely ornament for its own sake. Egyptian religious art often worked by shaping experience, not only by illustrating belief. A ceiling painted with stars could remind worshippers of night, eternity, and the ordered movement of the heavens. Birds, especially those with protective or solar associations, could signal divine watchfulness. In some temples, the ceiling and upper walls seemed designed to produce the sense that one had stepped beneath a transformed sky. The interior was not an imitation of the world outside so much as a model of how the world was believed to be held together. Some temples were attached to lakes, processional routes, or storehouses because the religious life of the site included movement, water, food, and maintenance. Sacred buildings did not exist in isolation. Ritual boats moved divine images at festivals. Courtyards and causeways allowed processions to unfold in stages. Sacred lakes, where present, may have served purification practices, symbolic rebirth, or simply the practical needs of the priesthood. Storehouses mattered too, because offerings had to be preserved, counted, and distributed. A temple had to be supplied with grain, bread, beer, oil, linen, incense, and livestock. Priests, gardeners, scribes, bakers, brewers, labourers, and herders all kept it functioning day after day. The sacred building was therefore also an institution, supported by the work of many people whose names are rarely preserved, even though their labour made the whole place possible. Holiness in Egypt was not only a matter of prayer or ceremony, it also depended on administration, storage, routine, and care. Across Egypt, temples varied in style and scale, yet they shared a basic idea. They were ordered places where human care met divine presence. That idea could be repeated in grand stone monuments or in much humbler shrines, but the underlying purpose remained strikingly consistent. A temple was a maintained relationship. It required cleaning, repairing, feeding, reciting, carrying, offering, and preserving. The gods were not understood as distant abstractions, but as powers who could dwell among humans when the proper forms were kept intact. In that sense, the temple was both a house and a system, both a symbolic cosmos and a working place. Its stones, rituals, and staff all took part in the same larger effort to keep balance in a world that was always changing. The boundaries of a temple were often as meaningful as the building itself. Walls, gateways, pylons, and thresholds created a sense of passing from one mode of existence to another. Outside lay ordinary movement, traffic, and sunlight. Inside lay a disciplined sequence of spaces, each with its own atmosphere and restricted access. The further inward one went, the more carefully controlled the environment became. This layering helped make the temple legible to the ancient mind. It was not simply a shelter for worship. It was a spatial argument, saying that divine order could be approached through sequence, restraint, and reverence. Even today, the surviving plan of many Egyptian temples still conveys that feeling of deliberate inwardness, like a story told through architecture rather than words. In a few places, temples were built, rebuilt, and expanded over many centuries, so a single sacred site could contain several historical layers at once. A visitor might stand before a wall from one dynasty, walk through a court added later, and pass into a sanctuary that had been reworked again after that. Egyptian religion was deeply concerned with continuity, but continuity did not mean stasis. Instead, later builders often preserved older forms while adapting them to new needs and new rulers. This makes temples especially fascinating to scholars because they are not frozen snapshots. They are accumulated histories where devotion, politics, memory, and repair have settled into the same place. A temple can therefore be both ancient and renewed, carrying the marks of many eras while still presenting itself as a stable home for the divine. The inscriptions carved into temple walls were part of this same careful order. They could record hymns, offerings, royal titles, victories, cosmological ideas, ritual instructions, and names of gods. Some texts were highly formal and repeated familiar phrases from one temple to another. Others were more specific to a particular site, local deity, or historical moment. For the ancient Egyptians, writing was not simply informational. It had presence. Words carved into stone could sustain memory, identify offerings, and help maintain sacred correctness. The walls of a temple were therefore not blank surfaces, but active participants in ritual life. Even when a modern reader cannot fully understand every line, the overall impression remains clear. Language and architecture work together to stabilize the holy. Temples also help define the geography of kingship. Pharaohs sponsored major sanctuaries not only out of piety, but because building and maintaining temples demonstrated legitimate rule. A king's relationship with the gods was publicly made visible in stone. By expanding a temple, decorating it, or dedicating offerings to a deity, the ruler showed that he was participating in the maintenance of cosmic order. This did not necessarily mean that every temple was entirely controlled from above in a simple way. Local priesthoods, regional traditions, and old occult practices mattered too, but royal patronage gave many temples their monumental form and their long-term resources. In this way, temples became places where theology and politics met, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes uneasily, but always with lasting consequences for the built environment. Some sacred places were especially associated with animals, and this reminds us how broad Egyptian temple religion could be. A god might be represented in a human form, in an animal form, or in a hybrid image that linked both. Certain animals were treated as manifestations or companions of divine power, and temples could shelter them, honor them, or receive offerings connected to them. Such practices can seem surprising from a modern distance, yet they fit naturally within Egyptian ideas about visible signs of the sacred. Animals moved through the landscape in ways humans could observe but not fully control, and that made them powerful symbols of vitality, mystery, and divine agency. A temple connected with an animal cult was not separate from mainline religion. It was part of a wider understanding that the gods could reveal themselves through many living forms. The temple estate often extended beyond the main stone enclosure. Fields, workshops, marshlands, granaries, and housing for workers may have belonged to the broader institution. This means that the temple was not only a ceremonial center, but an economic one as well. It managed resources, produced goods, and redistributed offerings. In some periods, temples became major landholders. In others, their scale was more limited, but they still relied on a network of supplies and personnel. This practical side of temple life is easy to overlook because the surviving monuments emphasize grandeur and sanctity. Yet the daily mechanics of provisioning were essential. Someone had to deliver grain, grind flour, wash linen, trim reeds, mix incense, and count jars. The holiness of the temple was built in part from repeated small acts of maintenance. Processions were among the most important ways temples extended themselves into the wider world. On festival days, the divine image might leave the sanctuary and travel along a route to another holy place, a river landing, a neighboring temple, or a ritual station along the way. These events could gather crowds, music, incense, movement, and anticipation. They allowed people who could never enter the deepest parts of a temple to still participate in its sacred life. Movement of a god through the city or landscape made the invisible temporarily visible. For a brief time, the boundary between hidden sanctuary and public world softened. Such moments must have carried a special emotional charge, especially in communities where festivals punctuated the year with rhythm and renewal. The materials used in temple construction also contributed to their atmosphere. Stone was favored for permanence, but not every part of a temple was stone in every period. Wooden doors, painted plaster, textile hangings, metal fittings, and brightly colored pigments could add warmth and movement to spaces that survive today in a stripped form. What modern visitors often see as bare ruins was once more vivid and layered. Red, blue, green, yellow, and black would have animated surfaces now faded by time and sun. The contrast between hard architecture and rich color helped temples feel both monumental and alive. Even small details, such as painted moldings or gilded elements, may have caught candlelight or sunlight in ways that made the space shimmer gently during ritual. Finally, across the long history of Egypt, temples remind us how deeply the Egyptians valued continuity between the human and divine worlds. A temple was not meant to be merely admired from a distance. It was a working place of presence, a carefully sustained dwelling for sacred power, and a mirror of the ordered universe as they understood it. Yet it was also deeply human in its making. Builders cut stone, artists painted ceilings, priests recited texts, workers carried water, and generations of communities returned to the same places with offerings and hopes. The grandeur of the temple came from that accumulation of care. In the quiet logic of Egyptian religion, the divine could remain close when the right forms were preserved, and the temple was one of the most enduring ways that belief took shape in the world. One of the most important things to understand about Egyptian temples is that they were deeply linked to kingship, and in a way that shaped nearly every stone, carving, and ritual gesture. Pharaohs were not only political rulers in the ordinary sense. In the Egyptian view, they carried a sacred responsibility to maintain Ma'at, the balanced order of the universe. That meant protecting the right relationship between gods, people, the land, and the seasons. Temple building was one of the clearest and most visible ways to perform that duty. When a king raised a new sanctuary, restored a damaged wall, or enlarged an older shrine, he was not simply funding construction. He was presenting himself as the guardian of harmony, someone who renewed the world by giving the gods a proper home. This is why temples so often display images of pharaohs in strongly formal poses, making offerings, presenting incense, or striking down enemies before divine witnesses. To modern eyes, these scenes can look repetitive, even formulaic, but they were never intended as casual decoration. They were statements of legitimacy, almost like sacred declarations carved into stone. The king is shown standing in the correct relationship to divine power, serving the gods while also receiving their support. Even in temples dedicated to a local deity, where the god might have been especially important to a particular region or city, royal authority remained visible. The temple reminded everyone that the ruler's power was not separate from religion. It was woven into it, as steady and formal as the temple columns themselves. Yet temple life was not only about the king, and not only about the grand scenes carved high on the walls. Behind the public image was a very exacting daily routine carried out by priests and temple attendants. Their work was quiet, repetitive, and highly disciplined. They washed the sacred image of the deity, or the cult statue that served as the god's earthly focus, with purified water. They brought food and drink offerings, arranged them on altars or tables, and removed the remains at the proper time. They burned incense so that fragrant smoke drifted through the chambers, and they changed linen garments placed on the divine image. These acts were performed with care because precision mattered. In the ancient mindset, repetition itself had power. The same gestures done correctly each day helped preserve balance in the world, like a rhythm that kept everything in place. The temple also regulated access in a very deliberate way. Ordinary people usually did not wander freely into the deepest sanctuaries, where the sacred image rested in darkness and incense-scented quiet. Instead, there was a layered structure of closeness and distance. The public might gather in outer courts, near gateways, or along processional avenues, while only trained personnel entered the inner rooms. That arrangement created a kind of sacred geography. The god was present but not casually available. Worship was both intimate and restricted, open in some moments and concealed in others. This separation was not necessarily a sign of exclusion in a modern social sense. Rather, it reflected an ancient understanding that holiness had degrees and that divine presence needed careful handling. The temple was a place where awe was maintained by boundaries. At certain times, though, the temple could become the center of a much broader communal life. Festivals transformed the atmosphere. Crowds gathered in the bright heat of the day or in the cooler hours when shadows stretched across the stone. Drums could sound, voices might chant in organized patterns, and musicians played instruments that added movement to the air. Food was shared. Offerings were carried in honor of the deity. In some cases, the god's sacred image was moved outside the temple, traveling in a shrine mounted on poles or placed on a ceremonial boat. These processions made divine presence visible in the most public way possible, but still within a strict ritual framework. The movement of the god through streets or along the river helped connect the temple to the wider city, turning sacred space into something that could be briefly extended into daily life. Temple inscriptions often mention donations, land grants, workshops, and lists of goods, and this can remind us that the temple was also an economic institution of considerable scale. In ancient Egypt, religious life and administration were not easily separated. Temples could own agricultural land, receive tribute, store produce, and support specialized labor. Craftspeople produced statues, jewelry, textiles, vessels, and ritual equipment. Scribes recorded deliveries and offerings. There were storerooms, granaries, and work areas alongside chapels and shrines. So when we picture an Egyptian temple, it helps to imagine both incense and bureaucracy, both sacred chanting and careful accounting. The same institution that honored a god also managed resources, personnel, and supply chains. In Egypt, holiness and administration lived side by side, each giving shape to the other in a way that feels almost inseparable. One reason Egyptian temples feel so enduring in the historical record is that they were built to last, and many were expanded or reused over centuries. A temple could begin in one dynasty and continue to grow under several later rulers, each adding their own inscriptions, gates, courts, or chapels. This meant that a single sacred complex often became a layered archive of royal ambition and devotional practice. Walking through such a temple in antiquity would have been like moving through time as well as space. Older stones might have been enclosed by newer ones, and the names of long-dead kings could remain visible beside more recent additions. The result was not a neat, single-period monument, but something more organic, a place that accumulated memory as steadily as it accumulated offerings. The physical arrangement of many temples also reflected the idea of movement from the ordinary toward the divine. As one proceeded inward, spaces often became darker, narrower, and more restricted. Courtyards gave way to halls, and halls to sanctuaries. Columns might rise like paper reeds or bundled stalks, suggesting a formalized natural world transformed into stone. Light entered in selective ways, sometimes striking carved reliefs or illuminating a doorway at certain moments of the day. That gradual reduction in openness created a feeling of progression. It was not simply architecture for shelter, it was architecture for transition. The visitor, whether priest, official, or participant in a festival, moved from public brightness into a realm of ritual concentration. In that setting, sound and scent mattered as much as sight. Egyptian temples were not silent in the way modern ruins are silent. They would have carried the smell of incense, oil, food offerings, fresh linen, and perhaps the earthy scent of mud brick, stone dust, or river dampness depending on the location. Footsteps on stone, the rustle of garments, the clink of ritual vessels, and the low murmuring of prayers or recitations would all have formed part of the atmosphere. Ancient ritual was sensory and embodied. It was not only about belief in the abstract, but about creating a carefully maintained environment in which the god could be approached through order, cleanliness, fragrance, and repeated speech. The priests who served in temples formed a hierarchy, and their roles could be surprisingly organized. Some served in short rotations rather than continuously, especially in later periods when temple service had become highly structured. Others held more specialized functions connected to recitation, purification, music, or administration. Not every temple employee was a priest in the narrow sense. There were cooks, bakers, brewers, gardeners, porters, scribes, and craftsmen whose work supported the ritual center. This wider network reminds us that temples were not isolated holy places floating above society. They were embedded in labor, provisioning, and management. A daily offering of bread and beer required actual grain, ovens, storage, transport, and accounting. Sacred life depended on practical systems. The temple's relationship to the surrounding community was therefore complex. For many people, it may have been a place seen from outside more often than entered closely. Yet its influence touched daily life through festivals, blessings, donations, and the visible authority of the god. People could bring votive offerings, seek protection, or remember family members in temple spaces dedicated to divine care. In some cases, smaller chapels or subsidiary shrines allowed more personal devotion, even if the central sanctuary remained restricted. This creates a layered picture of religion in Egypt, part state ceremony, part local custom, part household spirituality, all connected by the temple's central presence. The idea of divine image itself is also important here, though scholars still discuss the exact nature of cult statues and how ordinary worshippers understood them. The statue was not usually treated as a mere representation in the modern artistic sense. It could be regarded as a vessel or focus of divine presence after proper ritual activation. That is why its washing, dressing, and anointing were so significant. A god was not thought to be trapped in stone, but the statue gave presence a stable and manageable form. It was a point of contact between the unseen and the visible, between cosmic power and human care. This perspective helps explain why temple rituals seem so formal and so carefully repeated. They were acts of maintenance for a presence that was understood to be real, active, and worthy of exact attention. Royal participation in temple building also served another purpose. It connected the king to the distant past. By restoring ancient sanctuaries or adding inscriptions in traditional style, rulers presented themselves as heirs to an unbroken sacred line. They were not inventing legitimacy from nothing. They were positioning themselves within a long chain of divine service. This mattered especially in times of political instability, when a ruler might need to emphasize continuity. A temple inscription praising a king for repairing a shrine could be as politically meaningful as a battlefield victory. It said that the land was still under proper care, that the gods had not been neglected, and that order was being renewed through official action. At the same time, temples were not static in meaning. Their significance could shift depending on the period, the city, the deity, and the broader political climate. A sanctuary might be a major royal monument in one era and a regional religious center in another. Some temples became famous for oracles, others for healing, others for processional festivals. The surviving evidence is uneven, and much of what we know comes from inscriptions, later classical descriptions, and archaeological reconstruction. That means there are gaps, and in those gaps there is room for careful uncertainty. We can see the outline of temple life clearly, but not every detail is fully recoverable. Even so, the broad pattern is striking. Egyptian temples were not just buildings for worship. They were institutions where sacred order, royal power, communal memory, material wealth, and daily routine all met in one carefully maintained place. At Dendera, the Temple of Hathor preserves one of the most atmospheric ceilings in all of Egypt, and it is often the first place where a visitor begins to sense that a temple was never only a building, but a cosmos carefully arranged in stone. The carved ceiling in the hypostyle hall is alive with stars, sacred boats, winged figures, and circular astronomical scenes that seem to drift above the worshipper like a night sky made permanent. Hathor herself was associated with music, love, joy, and protection, and the temple reflects that gentler character in its rich decoration and enclosed, intimate feel. Scholars have long studied the so-called zodiac of Dendera, a later astronomical carving that once drew huge attention because it suggested that Egyptian temple walls were not simply religious surfaces, but also maps of time, order, and the heavens. Even today, the temple feels slightly dreamlike, with its dark passageways and softly lit chambers creating a sense of moving through the body of a sleeping world. From Dendera, it is natural to drift toward the older and more solemn temples at Abydos, a place linked above all with Osiris, Lord of the Dead and of renewal. Abydos became one of Egypt's most important pilgrimage centers because many Egyptians believed that it was connected with the god's burial place, or at least with the sacred memory of it. Kings and private individuals wanted their names preserved there, and some left false doors, stelae, and offerings so that they might symbolically join the god in the promise of continued life. The Temple of Seti I at Abydos is especially admired because of its refined relief work and its unusual plan, which includes a series of chapels honoring major deities. One chamber contains the famous Abydos king list, a carefully selected sequence of rulers that reveals how pharaohs wanted to present history itself as orderly and legitimate. The temple quietly blends devotion, political memory, and funerary hope, turning stone into a place where the past is continuously asked to remain alive. A little farther into the desert landscape, the Temple of Seti I at Abydos also preserves one of the most mysterious and discussed carvings in all of Egypt. In a high corridor, certain reliefs appear to resemble modern forms such as a helicopter, a submarine, or even an airplane, and this has inspired endless speculation outside academic circles. Egyptologists generally explain the carving as a palimpsest, where one set of royal inscriptions was later altered and overwritten, leaving unusual overlapping shapes. The site is fascinating precisely because it reminds us that temple walls were not frozen images, but living surfaces that could be revised when power changed, names shifted, or a king sought to replace his predecessor. The temple therefore reveals not only religious continuity, but also the practical and often fragile nature of political self-presentation in ancient Egypt. What seems mysterious at first becomes, on closer study, a record of correction, erasure, and layered time, as though the wall itself had remembered more than one age. Still in the Theban world, the mortuary temple of Ramesses II at Medinet Habu offers a different mood, one of strength, protection, and military triumph. While many Egyptian temples are delicate in atmosphere, Medinet Habu feels almost fortified, with massive walls and commanding gateways that give it the appearance of a palace citadel as much as a sacred place. Ramesses III decorated the temple with scenes of battles against the sea peoples and other enemies, presenting himself as the defender of order at a time when Egypt faced pressures from abroad and instability at home. Yet alongside the martial imagery, the temple also contains ritual scenes, divine processions, and beautiful reliefs that show the ordinary ceremonial rhythm of kingship. The temple's thick enclosure walls once protected not only the holy precinct, but also workshops, storerooms, and administrative spaces, reminding us that great temples were economic centers as well as religious ones. In the quiet of its courts, one can still imagine the sound of footsteps on sandstone and the measured voices of priests performing rites meant to keep the world intact. That blending of sacred and practical life becomes even more apparent in the Temple of Khnum at Esna, where the surviving columns and ceiling inscriptions belong largely to the Roman period, but preserve a deeply Egyptian religious tradition. Khnum, often depicted as a ram-headed creator deity, was associated with the shaping of human beings on a potter's wheel and with the life-giving waters of the Nile's source. The decoration at Esna is especially valuable because it contains long texts naming deities, festivals, ritual actions, and calendrical information, all of which help scholars understand how temple religion functioned in its latest centuries. The column capitals bloom into lotus forms, and the hall seems to gather the river's presence into an indoor garden of stone. Unlike the more ruined temples in the desert, Esna still feels inhabited by layers of time, where Greek, Roman, and older Egyptian elements meet without entirely blending. Its inscriptions are not simply ornamental, they are a kind of sacred memory system, preserving words that were meant to be spoken, repeated, and quietly renewed. Not all Egyptian temples were grand state projects in the same way, and the Temple of Kom Ombo offers a particularly striking example of dual worship. Unusually, it was dedicated to two gods at once: Sobek, the crocodile deity associated with fertility and the Nile, and Hararis, a form of Horus linked to kingship and the sky. The temple's symmetry reflects this shared devotion, with paired entrances, courts, and sanctuaries that create a subtle architectural dialogue between the two divine powers. This mirrored design may have been intended to honor balance, coexistence, and the possibility that different sacred forces could inhabit one place without conflict. In the reliefs, medical instruments appear alongside ritual scenes, which has led some scholars to note Kom Ombo's connection with healing and the practical concerns of life, as well as with formal worship. Nearby crocodile burials, including mummified crocodiles and related artifacts, reinforce the sense that the temple belonged to a religious landscape where the living river and its dangerous creatures were both feared and revered. There is something deeply restful about the temple's symmetry, as if the stone itself had been arranged to calm competing energies. Farther south, the island temple of Philae gives the impression of a sanctuary floating between water and sky. Dedicated chiefly to Isis, it was one of the last active centers of ancient Egyptian religion, surviving long into the Roman and even late antique periods. The setting matters enormously here, because the temple was not experienced as isolated stone, but as an island reached by boat, with the water reflecting pylons, columns, and palm-framed courtyards. For devotees of Isis, a goddess of healing, mourning, protection, and magical knowledge, Philae became a place of especially intimate devotion. Pilgrims arrived seeking favor, cure, or divine intervention, and the temple's inscriptions and ritual spaces suggest a living cult that extended beyond the old pharaonic age. When Christianity spread through the region, Philae remained active for some time, making it a remarkable witness to religious transition. Today, because the temple was moved to save it from flooding after the construction of the Aswan High Dam, it carries with it a modern history of rescue and displacement, adding another layer to its already long memory. The story of Philae leads naturally to the lesser-known Temple of Kalabsha, another Nubian sanctuary that was also relocated in the 20th century to protect it from rising waters. Built in the Roman period, but using traditional Egyptian forms, Kalabsha was dedicated to Mandulize, a local sun god, and its reliefs show how long Egyptian temple architecture continued to flourish under foreign rule. The temple's broad pylon, open courtyard, and sanctuary chamber follow ancient patterns, yet the inscriptions reflect a time when emperors rather than native pharaohs controlled the land. This fusion of old form and new political reality is one of the quiet fascinations of late Egyptian temples. They were not relics in a simple sense, but active spaces in which traditional ritual language could still be used under changing empires. Kalabsha, standing now near the modern reservoir landscape, offers a peaceful example of continuity under pressure, a monument that has traveled yet retained its identity. The stones seem to hold their composure, as if remembering how to remain sacred even when geography itself has been rewritten. In the town of Edfu, the great temple of Horus provides perhaps the most complete and vivid picture of temple life in the later pharaonic era. Built mainly during the Ptolemaic period, it is extraordinarily well preserved, and its massive walls allow us to reconstruct the ceremonial path that priests once followed from outer daylight into inner mystery. Horus, the falcon god of kingship and victorious order, was worshipped here in a temple that dramatized the mythic struggle between Horus and Seth, the forces of legitimate rule and chaos. The walls are filled with ritual inscriptions that describe festivals, offerings, and sacred performances with remarkable detail, almost as though the temple were preserving its own manual of operation. Scholars often turn to Edfu when they want to understand how temple liturgy may have functioned in practice, because the texts are so rich and systematic. Walking through its halls in imagination, one can sense the slow accumulation of incense, the flash of ceremonial metal, and the quiet authority of a building that was designed to make divine presence feel enduring and precise. Not far away in scale, though very different in purpose, the temples of the Sinai Peninsula remind us that Egyptian sacred architecture was not confined to the Nile Valley itself. At Serabit el-Khadim, a temple dedicated to Hathor stood within a remote turquoise mining region, serving miners, officials, and travelers in a harsh landscape of rock and wind. Hathor here was not only a goddess of joy, but also a protector of those working far from home, in dangerous and isolated conditions. The site is famous for its association with some of the earliest alphabetic inscriptions, often called Proto-Sinaitic, which may have developed under the influence of Egyptian signs and administrative practices. This makes Serabit el-Khadim especially important for the history of writing, as it suggests a meeting point between Egyptian religious culture and the labor communities of the desert frontier. The temple itself is partly ruined, but the setting is memorable for its silence and openness, with the plateau stretching out under a bright and unforgiving sky. It feels like a place where a temple had to do its work not in the midst of a city, but at the edge of endurance. That sense of edge and endurance appears again in the small rock-cut temples of Nubia and the northern frontier, where Egyptian religion adapted to border territories and local populations. Some of these shrines were dedicated to forms of Ammon, Isis, Horus, or local deities assimilated into Egyptian religious language. In such places, temple architecture often became more modest and embedded in the landscape, blending into cliffs or riverbanks rather than dominating them. Yet even in smaller scale, the principles remained familiar: an outer approach, a transition zone, a holy interior, and a carefully guarded threshold between common space and divine presence. These frontier temples are valuable because they show how flexible the Egyptian sacred system could be. It was not only the monumental centers of Thebes or Memphis that mattered, but also the outlying sanctuaries where trade, travel, diplomacy, and local devotion intersected. The very act of placing a temple at the boundary of the known world gave it a special atmosphere, as if the gods were being asked to keep watch over the margins of human movement. In that quiet watchfulness, one can hear the deeper purpose of all these sacred buildings: to make order visible, stable, and gently continuous through time. The River Nile shaped temple life in practical and symbolic ways, and it is difficult to understand Egypt's temples without first understanding the water that sustained them. Many of the great sanctuaries stood close to the riverbank, or were linked to the Nile by processional causeways, canals, harbours, and landing stages. This was not only a matter of convenience. In a country where the desert pressed in from both sides, the river was the broad living corridor through which people, animals, goods, and ideas could move. The Nile was the great road of Egypt, smoother and more reliable in many seasons than travel over rough ground. Stone blocks for new buildings, timber from farther regions, jars of oil, baskets of grain, bundles of reeds, incense, and ritual equipment could all arrive by boat. In that sense, the temple was never an isolated stone monument. It belonged to a working landscape of docks, tracks, embankments, and river traffic. The sacred building depended on the river's patient flow, and the river in turn gave the temple a setting where the movement of the world could be brought under ritual order. Temples often had sacred lakes, and these are among the most quietly revealing features of Egyptian religious architecture. A lake beside a temple was not merely decorative, and it was not always intended for the public in a modern sense. It could be used in rites of purification, for the washing of priestly hands and bodies, for the preparation of offerings, and perhaps for symbolic acts of renewal tied to creation, rebirth, and the first emergence of order from watery chaos. Egyptian religious thought often imagined the world itself as arising from primeval water, and so a temple lake carried meanings deeper than its still surface suggested. Priests who moved around it were entering a world where cleanliness was not only physical but cosmic. Water could remove impurity, but it could also recall the first beginnings of life. The exact use of each temple lake varied from site to site, and not every detail is fully preserved, yet the broad pattern is clear. These waters formed a calm boundary between ordinary space and sacred space. They reflected the light, the walls, and the sky, and in doing so they turned the temple into a place where the seen world seemed to double itself in silence. Some temple processions were carried out by boat, especially during festivals, and this must have been among the most impressive experiences in ancient Egyptian civic life. A divine image, usually kept within a shrine, could be placed in a portable bark or ceremonial vessel and brought out from the inner sanctuary. The god's presence then became mobile, moving through the landscape with deliberate slowness. This was practical because certain festivals required a deity to visit another temple, a nearby shrine, or a place of special importance. But it was also theatrical in the most ancient and sacred sense. The movement of the boat made divine action visible. People could witness from a distance or from the riverbank the possibility that a god was traveling among them. The vessel itself was more than transport. It echoed the solar bark of the sun god, imagined to cross the sky by day and the underworld by night, and it also reflected the everyday reality of river life. In a civilization so dependent on boats for commerce, administration, and travel, a sacred boat carried both divine dignity and familiar practicality. It was a vessel of ritual, but also a recognizable object of the Nile world, transformed by ceremony into something luminous and briefly extraordinary. At temple sites, storage areas and workshops often stood nearby, and these spaces remind us that a temple was sustained by continuous material effort. The smooth colonnades and polished statues of a sanctuary depended on a hidden network of workers, inventories, and supplies. Storerooms held grain, oil, linen, incense, wine, tools, and vessels needed for daily offerings and seasonal ceremonies. Workshops provided the means to repair objects, weave textiles, prepare food, shape metal, and maintain the many small necessities of worship. A temple was therefore not only a house of the gods, but also a managed economy with land, labor, and accounting. Its life required records, deliveries, weighing, measuring, and careful distribution. Someone had to grind grain and bake bread, twist rope, cut linen, bring water, sweep floors, polish copper, and keep track of what came in and went out. The spiritual calm of the sanctuary rested upon these ordinary actions repeated day after day. That quiet labor is easy to overlook because it leaves less dramatic traces than a statue or a wall relief, yet it was central to the functioning of sacred life. The temple did not float above society. It was woven into it, supported by administrative order and the work of many hands. The smell of a functioning temple must have been layered and complex, far richer than the dry air of the ruins we know today. Resinous incense, natron, oil, fresh bread, onions or garlic from workspaces, flowers brought as offerings, stone dust from carving, linen cleaned in lye, and river moisture drifting from nearby channels would all have mingled in the air. Ancient texts praise the pleasing aroma of offerings, and temple scenes on the walls often show the delivery of perfumes, unguents, and incense, as part of a proper ritual order. Some of these substances had practical uses as well as symbolic ones. Oils protected skin, resins burned as smoke, and natron cleansed surfaces, yet the sensory effect was unmistakably ceremonial. To enter an Egyptian temple was not simply to see sacred art, it was to step into a carefully managed atmosphere of scent, texture, sound, and humidity. The floor might feel cool underfoot, linen could rustle softly, bronze doors might creak, priests would chant in measured tones, offerings would be arranged with almost tender precision. The temple was alive in a sensory way that modern visitors can only imagine, and that sensory life was part of what made sacred order feel real. A place that smelled right, sounded right, and moved right was understood to be in harmony with the divine. If we picture an Egyptian temple beside the Nile, then we can begin to see how water and stone met in long patience. The river carried the supplies, the visitors, the officials, and the meanings. It linked local communities to broader political and religious networks. A sanctuary could receive goods from distant estates, regional towns, or faraway trade routes, all converging on the bank before entering the temple precinct. The temple, in turn, gave those movements a sacred shape. It turned the practical fact of transport into ritual procession, and the ordinary need for water into a symbol of purification, fertility, and renewal. Ancient Egyptians did not separate sacred order from nature as sharply as later cultures often do. The river was not a backdrop to religion, it was part of religion's own logic. The great temples of Egypt therefore belonged to a world in which a boat, a canal, a basin, a storeroom, and a sanctuary could all participate in the same deep pattern of life. Standing near the Nile, the temple did not resist the river. It listened to it, used it, honored it, and shaped itself in its rhythm. The river also gave temple life a sense of time that was calmer than any single calendar date. The flood, the retreat of the waters, the drying of the banks, and the return of cultivation all shaped the year. Even where the exact ancient understanding is difficult to reconstruct, it is clear that priests and builders were attentive to seasonal change. The rhythm of the Nile touched agriculture, taxation, labor, and festival planning alike. Temples therefore operated within a cycle larger than the walls that enclosed them. Offerings depended on harvests, processions depended on navigable water, and maintenance depended on the availability of people and materials at the right time. A sanctuary built beside the river could feel the passing seasons through sound and smell as much as through formal record. In high water, the banks might seem closer to the threshold. In lower water, mud and reeds might reveal themselves differently. These subtle shifts would have reminded temple workers that sacred order was always lived through the changing body of the land. The river did not merely supply life once and for all. It repeated itself, and that repetition became part of temple thought. The connection between water and sanctity was also visible in the way Egyptians imagined purity. Priests were expected to wash regularly, to shave certain parts of the body, and to maintain a cleanliness appropriate to their duties. This was not just a matter of personal hygiene. Purity marked the transition from ordinary life into ritual service. Water then became a threshold substance. It could remove what was symbolically inappropriate, but it could also prepare the body for contact with the divine. The sacred lake, the riverbank, and the purification basin all belonged to this larger logic. Yet it would be too simple to imagine that Egyptian religion treated cleanliness in a single rigid way. Practices probably differed by temple, by period, and by office. Some details remain uncertain because texts are selective and archaeological remains are incomplete. Still, the broad pattern survives. Temple personnel were expected to move with care through a world where water carried moral and cosmic force. Their bodies were part of the ritual machinery, and washing was one of the ways that human beings adjusted themselves to divine presence. The river environment also encouraged temples to become centers of movement, not just stillness. Causeways led from temple gates toward landing points, and these processional routes guided both people and sacred objects. During major festivals, crowds may have gathered along these routes, watching the slow progress of priests, standard bearers, musicians, and the enclosed image of the god. The sight of a ritual journey would have been powerful because it made the unseen visible. Instead of a god remaining hidden in the deepest chamber, the divine could be imagined as traveling, meeting, and returning. Such movement would have belonged to a larger religious imagination in which gods were not fixed in one mode of presence. They could rest, emerge, depart, and return. The river gave this theology a practical medium. A boat gliding over water created a kind of sacred interval, suspended between departure and arrival. In the soft shifting of oars and rope, the festival became a temporary bridge between human settlement and divine action. Even now, the thought of those slow processions carries a certain hush with it. The materials gathered at a temple site also reveal the breadth of Egypt's connections. Incense might come from distant regions. Timber may have traveled from areas where trees were more abundant than in the Nile Valley. Stone for construction could be quarried far away and floated or dragged to its destination in huge, carefully coordinated efforts. Linen was produced through patient domestic and industrial work. Grain moved from agricultural estates into temple stores. Every object implies a chain of human labor before it reached the sanctuary. Temples were therefore not sealed off from the wider economy, but deeply embedded in it. The sacred depended on trade, administration, and transport. This could give temple life an aura of abundance, but also a constant need for organization. Offerings had to be renewed, lamps needed fuel, statues had to be dressed or decorated, floors needed sweeping, walls needed repair, and vessels needed cleansing. The monument appears stable, but its stability was maintained by a constant flow of materials. In that sense, the temple was less like a frozen object than like a living node in a larger network of exchange and care. Even the stone itself was not entirely still in the imagination of ancient Egyptians. On temple walls, carved reliefs often show boats, offerings, priests, and sacred actions repeated in exacting patterns. The images are formal, but they are also full of motion held in place. A ritual boat carved in stone suggests that movement can become eternal when represented properly. A river scene, once fixed on a wall, no longer drifts away. It remains, yet it also points to the flow that made the temple possible. This tension between motion and permanence may be one of the most beautiful aspects of Egyptian temple culture. The river changed daily, but the temple sought to endure. The river delivered and removed, while the temple preserved and repeated. Neither side existed without the other. The sacred building drew stability from the current world, and the current world found in the temple a form of order that could outlast a single flood season, a single reign, or a single generation. So when we imagine temples of Egypt near the Nile, we can let the picture become slower and fuller. There is the broad water sliding past reed beds and moored boats. There are workers unloading jars and bundles at the landing stage. There is the smell of wet wood, incense, bread, and river mud. There are priests moving with measured steps from washing place to offering hall. There are storerooms filled with the practical goods of religion. There are festivals in which a god is carried out into the light, and the people watch in reverent quiet. And there is the great enduring meeting of water and stone, each shaping the other in its own way. The river carried the life of Egypt, and the temple gave that life a sacred form. Some of Egypt's most famous temples were not only places of worship, but also enduring records of political history, preserved in stone with a seriousness that ordinary writing materials could never match. Rulers across many dynasties left inscriptions on temple walls because a temple was one of the safest, most visible, and most prestigious places to preserve a message. Papyrus could burn, wood could rot, and small monuments could be moved or broken, but a temple wall stood in the protected rhythm of ritual life. When a king added his name to a sanctuary, he was not simply marking ownership. He was tying his memory to sacred space, hoping that the gods, the priests, and the generations that followed would continue to encounter his name in a place of reverence. In that sense, temples became archives of power, but they were archives shaped by devotion as much as by politics. A line of hieroglyphs might celebrate a donation, announce a victory, or record restoration after damage, yet it also carried a quieter message. This ruler belonged here, and his memory had been invited into eternity. This is especially visible in places that were built, expanded, or restored over very long periods. Egyptian temples often did not rise all at once as single, finished projects. Instead, they developed gradually, almost like living organisms, with each reign leaving a new layer of attention. A later pharaoh might inherit a temple begun by earlier rulers and continue the work, either out of piety, ambition, or a practical desire to strengthen legitimacy. Columns could be added, courts widened, pylons rebuilt, and inscriptions renewed. Sometimes an aging structure needed repair after floods, shifting sand, or political neglect. Sometimes a new dynasty simply wished to add its own mark to an old and respected sanctuary. The result was a layered monument, where one age rested on another in a sequence that could span centuries. In some cases, later kings even erased earlier names and replaced them, hoping to claim the sacred authority of the site for themselves. That act of erasure could be strangely intimate: a royal name chiseled away, a cartouche recut, a memory revised in stone. Yet even those alterations reveal how strongly the temple was tied to legitimacy. To improve a temple was to show reverence, to alter one was to contend with the past. Egyptian temples were also deeply regional, and that regional character gave each sanctuary its own atmosphere and identity. A great temple in the south might reflect local theology, political alliances, or cult traditions different from those in the north, even when both were dedicated to gods known across Egypt. Temples were not interchangeable buildings with identical meanings. They belonged to landscapes, to cities, to riverbanks, to local priesthoods, and to long traditions of sacred memory. In one place, a god might be strongly linked to kingship, in another to fertility, healing, protection, or the annual cycle of the river. Gods such as Ammon, Ptah, Hathor, Horus, Khnum, Sobek, and others each had their own important sanctuaries and local expressions. Their myths were not always fixed in a single form. They changed slightly from region to region, and priests often emphasized one aspect of a deity over another, depending on the character of the shrine. The religious map of Egypt was therefore rich and varied, not uniform. Even when travelers recognized the same divine names, they might encounter different rituals, different festivals, and different sacred traditions, all unfolding beneath the same broad Egyptian sky. This variety gave temple culture a living complexity, as though the land itself had many devotional voices speaking at once. Because temple construction lasted so long, the architecture often shows changing styles, and those changes can feel like a quiet conversation between generations. Earlier forms may appear more compact or traditional, built with proportions and arrangements that seem rooted in older ceremonial habits. Later additions can become larger, more elaborate, or influenced by outside cultures, especially when Egypt was part of broader Mediterranean worlds. A temple courtyard might open into a monument that was begun under one dynasty and finished under another, while decorative styles shift subtly from one wall to the next. Even the relief carving can reveal changes in taste, technique, or political intention. Greek and Roman rulers also built within Egyptian temple traditions, adapting them to new political realities while still honoring local sacred conventions. They often preserved the outward language of pharaonic kingship, wearing Egyptian crowns in temple reliefs and making offerings to Egyptian gods, even as their own cultures and empires shaped the wider context. That continuity is one of the remarkable features of Egyptian religious culture. The forms remained recognizable, yet they were flexible enough to absorb change. A temple could therefore be both ancient and contemporary, carrying the authority of the past while adapting to the needs of the present. For the visitor, that makes the walls feel layered not only in stone, but in time. The temple was not separate from history. It was one of the places where history was written in public stone, in a voice meant to be seen slowly and repeatedly. Victories, dedications, divine favors, and royal names were all set into the walls with the hope that they would endure. The temple facade could announce military success. An inner chamber could record a gift from the king to a god. A corridor might preserve a restoration text explaining that a sanctuary had been renewed after decay. These inscriptions were never accidental decoration. They were part of the temple's active meaning. They shaped how people understood the ruler, the deity, and the relationship between earthly order and divine blessing. Some of the claims were practical, some ceremonial, and some almost literary in their style, filled with formulaic praise and carefully repeated titles. Over time, many of these records survived far longer than the events they described, outlasting the dynasties that commissioned them. In that way, the temple became a witness that remained after the voices were gone. The stone did not speak with urgency, but with endurance. Its language was meant to last. When we stand among those remains today, we are seeing a kind of accumulated time that can be felt in the proportions of a courtyard, in the weathering of a column base, or in the shadow cast by a broken lintel. The temple is not one story, but many stories laid one over another, each trying to speak to the future in a language of permanence. A visitor might notice a wall from one reign meeting a doorway from another, or a reused block containing older carving hidden within newer stonework. Scholars often study these details carefully, since the order of additions can reveal shifts in political power, religious emphasis, and regional influence. Even the unfinished corners can be meaningful, suggesting interrupted building campaigns or changing plans. Yet beyond the scholarly reading, there is a softer impression as well. Ancient temples invite the sense that time itself has become visible. They hold stillness but not emptiness. They are crowded with memory, even when the corridors are quiet. The priests who served these temples also helped maintain this long continuity, though their names are often less visible than the kings. Temple life depended on regular attention. Statues had to be dressed, offerings arranged, incense burned, floors cleaned, and sacred spaces protected from disorder. A temple inscription might glorify a pharaoh, but the daily life of the shrine depended on many hands. In some periods, priestly families held strong local influence, passing responsibilities through generations and shaping the character of a sanctuary over centuries. Their work helped ensure that the temple remained a functioning center rather than a mere ruin of old authority. In this way, the temple's history was not only a matter of grand royal gestures, it was also a history of maintenance, routine, and continuity. The persistent care of a sanctuary could be as meaningful as its construction. A temple kept alive for many generations became a place where devotion was repeated so often that it almost seemed woven into the stone. The sacred authority of a temple also depended on its relationship to landscape and memory. Many temples were built on sites that had already been important for generations, perhaps because of an ancient cult, a holy hill, a nearby settlement, or the presence of a revered burial ground. The location itself mattered. The river, the horizon, the desert edge, or the approach of a procession route could all contribute to the meaning of a sanctuary. In some cases, older sacred associations were absorbed into later buildings, so that the temple became a bridge between very old local traditions and the official religion of the state. This made the architecture feel rooted in place. Even when a temple was rebuilt several times, it still seemed to belong to its original terrain. The builders were not creating a neutral structure that could be moved elsewhere. They were working with a site that already had memory embedded in it, and that memory deepened the power of each later restoration. The practice of adding and replacing inscriptions also tells us something about the Egyptian view of time. They did not necessarily see the past as something distant and sealed off. The past could be renewed, revised, or brought forward into the present through ritual building. A ruler who restored a temple was not only repairing damage, he was often participating in a sacred continuity that linked him to earlier kings and to the gods themselves. Even when a name was erased, the very act of erasure acknowledged the significance of what had come before. The old ruler mattered enough to be removed, the new ruler mattered enough to take his place. This is one of the subtler features of temple history. The walls preserve both memory and struggle, both reverence and competition. The inscriptions may seem formal, but behind their formulae lies a human world of ambition, devotion, succession, and the desire not to disappear. Temples could also reflect the movement of ideas across Egypt's long history. In some periods, religious emphasis shifted as political centers rose and fell. A god associated with one city might gain wider prominence, and a temple that once served a local cult might become part of a broader state ideology. Yet even in those changes, older meanings were rarely fully abandoned. They remained present in ritual habits, in traditional titles, and in the spatial logic of the sanctuary. That is why Egyptian temple culture can feel so dense. It is not simply old, it is accumulated. A single site may hold echoes of dozens of reigns, changing customs and overlapping theological interpretations. For modern observers, this can make the ruins feel both orderly and mysterious. The basic pattern is clear, but the layers resist complete simplification. There is something especially moving about the way temples preserved royal names, because a name in Egyptian thought was never merely a label. It carried identity, presence, and the possibility of remembrance beyond death. To carve a name into a temple wall was to place it in the care of the gods and in the path of countless later viewers. The name could be spoken by priests, recited in ritual, or simply seen in passing by those who entered the shrine. In that sense, the temple helped transform political rule into sacred memory. Yet time was never fully obedient to these intentions. Some names were lost through erosion, some through deliberate destruction, and some through the slow silence of abandonment. Still, enough survived to let us trace the rhythm of those ambitions. The walls remain, weathered but persistent, carrying fragments of voices that once expected to endure forever. And so the temples of Egypt can be understood not only as religious monuments, but as enduring records of civilization itself. They preserve devotion, power, craft, local identity, and historical change in a single architectural form. They remind us that sacred places were also public documents, carefully built to outlast the moment and speak to future generations. In their columns and carved scenes, we see not just gods and kings, but the long, patient effort of a culture to make memory visible. Some temples were closely tied to astronomy and the movement of the heavens. In ancient Egypt, the sky was not treated as a distant background to earthly life. It was part of the sacred order itself, something to be observed, interpreted, and quietly woven into the design of holy places. Priests were trained to notice patterns above them with careful attention, especially the turning of the sun, the appearance of stars, and the return of familiar celestial cycles. When a temple was planned, its direction could reflect that awareness. A doorway might face a certain point on the horizon, or a passage might allow a beam of light to enter at a particular season. In this way, architecture became more than shelter for worship. It became a measured response to the sky. Even if we cannot always know the exact intention behind every surviving structure, the pattern is clear enough to suggest that temples were often imagined as places where heaven and earth could briefly meet in ordered harmony. This relationship with the sky did not mean that every temple functioned like a scientific observatory. The ancient Egyptians were not simply recording astronomy in the modern sense, with detached instruments and abstract equations. Their observations were tied to ritual, symbolism, and the practical needs of religious life. Yet that does not make the work any less precise. In many cases, religion, measurement, architecture, and cosmic order were all connected in a single worldview. A temple was not only a house for a god, it was also a carefully arranged model of the universe as they understood it. The ground beneath it, the walls around it, and the roof above it could all participate in that larger idea. Some scholars describe the temple as a microcosm, a smaller version of the world. Others emphasize how much its layout may have reflected political and religious authority. Both views can be true at once. In the quiet darkness of the inner halls, the building itself could seem to guide a person from the ordinary world into a more concentrated sacred reality, one shaped by order, direction, and the steady rhythms of the cosmos. The famous temple of Abu Simbel is often discussed in this context because of the way sunlight penetrates its inner spaces at particular times of year. The effect has become almost legendary, and for good reason. At certain moments, the sun enters deep into the sanctuary and reaches the statues placed there, creating a brief encounter between light and stone that feels deliberate and almost ceremonial. This kind of alignment captures the imagination because it reveals the depth of ancient planning. The builders were not merely stacking stones in a monumental way, they were coordinating structure, landscape, and solar timing with extraordinary care. Other sanctuaries also had remarkable alignments or light effects, though they may be less widely known today. Some are only partially preserved, and others are difficult to interpret with certainty after thousands of years of change. Still, the surviving evidence suggests that the Egyptians understood the temple as a place where natural cycles could be made visible. When sunlight touched an inner image, it may have been read not only as a physical event, but as a sign of divine presence, a fleeting reminder that sacred time was unfolding exactly as it should. Temple calendars were linked to festivals, agricultural seasons, and ritual renewals. For the ancient Egyptians, time was not experienced as a simple line. It moved in recurring waves, marked by familiar returns rather than one-way progress. The flooding of the Nile was one of the greatest of these rhythms, because it shaped both farming and religious expectation. The heliacal rising of stars such as Sirius was also important, especially in connection with the new year and the renewal of life after the long dry season. Seasonal change, the waxing and waning of daylight, and the repeating movement of the heavens all helped structure temple life. Festivals might follow these cycles, with ceremonies performed at carefully chosen moments to reinforce the sense that the world was ordered and sustained. In this way, temples turned nature into ceremony. Rain, flood, sun, and star were not merely environmental facts. They became part of a living sacred calendar. Even if different regions and different periods of Egyptian history observed these patterns in slightly different ways, the underlying idea remained steady. Divine order could be experienced through time itself if one paid close enough attention. Even the shadows inside a temple mattered. Anyone who steps from bright daylight into a deep ancient sanctuary can feel this change immediately. The air seems cooler, the sound more contained, and the eye must slowly adjust to a dimmer world. In Egyptian temples, this transition was part of the experience of sacred space. The outer courts were more open, more public, and more touched by the visible world. But as one moved deeper inside, the rooms became narrower and darker, and the space seemed to gather around silence. This progression may have evoked the journey from the everyday world into a more concentrated realm of divine presence. It was a movement not just through architecture, but through atmosphere. Light narrowed, sound softened, and attention became more focused. A priest carrying a ritual object through those chambers would have crossed not only physical thresholds, but symbolic ones as well. The design itself participated in reverence. In a culture that valued balance and carefully maintained order, even the fading of light could become meaningful, a quiet passage toward mystery rather than a simple absence of illumination. For modern visitors, this can still be felt in surviving temples. Even when a site lies in ruins, the arrangement of stones may preserve a faint memory of its original purpose. A wall line can still suggest a sightline toward the horizon. A doorway can still frame a strip of sun at the right season. A corridor, though damaged by time, may continue to draw the eye inward in the same way it once guided ritual movement. This is one reason temple ruins can feel so strangely exact. They are not only remnants of decoration or engineering. They are records of attention. The builders noticed the sky, the land, the seasons, and the desired path of light, and they built accordingly. The stones seem to remember that direction, as if the temple was still waiting for a particular hour to arrive. For the modern observer, that precision can create a very calm and reflective feeling. The building is silent but not empty. It holds the trace of a conversation between human craft and the natural world, a conversation that took place long ago and still seems to linger in the alignment of the walls. The Egyptians also connected these celestial concerns with temple ritual in a way that made the whole complex feel alive through the day and through the year. At dawn, when the first light touched an outer facade, the temple could seem to awaken. At noon, the contrast of bright sun and shaded interior made the structure feel divided between worlds. At dusk, the fading light could soften the surfaces of carved reliefs and statues, making them appear almost suspended between visibility and disappearance. These shifting conditions were not accidental in the religious imagination. They echoed larger ideas about transformation, renewal, and the movement between hidden and revealed things. In a place where priests recited hymns, offered incense, and tended sacred images, the sun itself could appear as a participant in the ritual order. The changing sky gave the temple a daily rhythm, while the calendar gave it a yearly one. Together, those cycles made sacred life feel continuous, measured, and deeply embedded in nature. There is also a sense in which astronomical temple planning reflected confidence in the stability of the cosmos. If a doorway could be aligned to a sunrise, then the sunrise could be counted on. If a ceremony could be timed to a star's return, then the heavens were understood as reliable companions to human life. That idea mattered in a world where the Nile's flooding, the agricultural year, and the welfare of the state all depended on patterns that had to be observed carefully and remembered accurately. The temple, then, was not only a religious center, but a place where cosmic stability was honored and reinforced. This does not mean that the Egyptians believed the universe was unchanging in a simple way. They knew that the world could be dangerous, uncertain, and full of disruption, but their sacred architecture suggests a strong desire to locate order within that uncertainty. A temple aligned to the sky made a statement without words. The world is measurable, the sacred cycle returns, and human life can be placed within a larger pattern. Some of the most evocative details come from the way light behaves inside these monuments. In a chamber cut from stone, even a small shaft of sunlight can transform the feeling of space. Dust in the air may become visible, drifting like a thin veil. Carved figures on a wall may suddenly appear and then recede again as the light shifts. Gold, painted plaster, or polished surfaces would once have amplified these effects, making the temple interior feel animated by glimmers and shadows. We can only imagine much of this now, because many temples have lost their original color and finishing. Time, weather, and human reuse have changed them, but traces remain. Those traces help us understand that the temple was not intended to be seen all at once in an even modern light. It was experienced gradually, and with ceremony. The movement from brightness into darkness could heighten awareness so that each step forward felt measured. This is one reason temple architecture can still affect visitors so powerfully. Its design works on the body as much as on the mind. The alignment of temples with the heavens also reveals something quieter about Egyptian sacred thought. It suggests patience. To build with the sun and stars in mind, one had to observe over time, to wait, and to return again and again to the same horizon. Such work required memory as much as skill. A priest or architect would have needed to know when a certain star rose, where the sun appeared on the solstice, or how the shadows moved across a courtyard at different seasons. This was not dramatic knowledge in the modern sense, but careful, repeated knowledge, the kind that accumulates through generations. It belongs to a civilization that valued continuity. A temple, once aligned, could serve that memory for centuries. Even after dynasties changed and rulers came and went, the building might continue to witness the same celestial events. In that way, the temple became a long-term keeper of time, far older than any single worshipper who entered it. And so when we think of Egyptian temples and astronomy together, we are not simply thinking about ancient curiosity about stars. We are thinking about a worldview in which the sky was a sacred text, the sun was a daily ritual partner, and architecture could help translate cosmic movement into human experience. The priest standing in a quiet chamber, the builder measuring an axis, the festival procession timed to a season, and the visitor who felt a shaft of light in a dark sanctuary were all participating in that same broad cultural vision. It was a vision in which the divine could be approached through order, repetition, and careful placement. The temple did not merely stand beside the cosmos. In the Egyptian imagination, it belonged to it. Not all Egyptian temples were built for the same kind of god, and that variety is one of the quiet wonders of ancient religion. Some temples were devoted to major state deities whose names reached across the whole Nile Valley, while others belonged to local gods known mainly in one town, one district, or even one particular sacred landscape. In Egypt, divinity was rarely confined to a single simple form. A god might appear as a cosmic ruler in one setting, as a helpful local power in another, and as a more intimate household presence somewhere else. The same sacred figure could gather many identities over time, each one reflecting a different need, a different story, or a different place. This flexible religious world allowed temple worship to hold many layers at once. A great temple could serve national ideology and royal ceremony, but it could also shelter a deity whose importance was felt most strongly by nearby families, craftsmen, farmers, or priests. Even within one cult, the god's character could shift gently from one era to another, or from one ritual context to the next. To modern eyes, this can seem complicated, but to the ancient Egyptians it may have felt natural. Divine power was not limited to a single box or a single name. It could be broad and local at the same time, distant and present, immense and personal. A major god could be honored in a great temple with towering pylons and rich gifts, while also being understood in a smaller neighborhood shrine under a more specific form or title. In that sense, the temple world of Egypt was not uniform at all. It was layered, adaptable, and full of overlapping sacred identities. Animal symbolism played a major role in that world, and it did so in a way that was both practical and deeply poetic. Bulls, falcons, crocodiles, cats, ibises, jackals, and many other creatures could all be linked to divine force, royal legitimacy, protection, wisdom, or fertility. These animals were not simply decorative motifs. They carried meaning that could be read in temple reliefs, statues, ritual objects, and sacred narratives. A falcon could point towards sky, kingship, or divine vision. A bull might suggest strength, virility, or the powerful presence of a god on earth. A cat could evoke protection and alertness, especially in settings where danger was imagined in both visible and invisible forms. Even the crocodile, feared for its physical power, could be understood as a vessel of sacred might rather than only as a threat. Egyptian temple art often treated the animal world as a language of signs. The physical world was full of messages, and the human task was to notice them. Nature was not just observed in a descriptive sense, it was interpreted. The movement of a bird, the behavior of a sacred animal, the shape of a creature's body, or the habits associated with it could all become part of a religious vocabulary. In temple scenes and inscriptions, animals often appear as companions to gods, as emblems of particular powers, or as forms through which divine qualities became visible. This gave the sacred landscape a living texture. The temple was not isolated from nature. It was part of a cosmos in which animals, humans, gods, and kings were all connected through meaning. Some temples could even house or connect with sacred animals in very specific traditions, and this aspect of Egyptian religion has fascinated archaeologists for generations. In certain cults, animals were not only symbols, but also living beings treated with ritual respect. They might be housed, fed, adorned, or cared for in ways that mark them out from ordinary creatures. Their presence linked the temple to the god in a direct and tangible way. When these animals died, they were sometimes given burials that were themselves highly ritualized, and those burials have become important evidence for scholars trying to understand how cult practice worked on the ground. The remains of mummified animals, votive deposits, and carefully arranged cemetery spaces show that the relationship between deity and creature was not simple. It could involve embodiment, symbolic association, divine title, or sacred companionship, depending on the cult, the period, and the local tradition. In some cases, the animal may have been understood as a living manifestation of a god. In others, it may have served as a representative, a sign, or a ritual focus for human devotion. The evidence often resists neat explanations, and that uncertainty is part of what makes the subject so interesting. Ancient worshippers may not have separated symbol from presence as sharply as later readers do. For them, the boundary between the sacred image, the sacred animal, and the god's living power may have been fluid. Temples made room for that fluidity. They were places where the divine could be encountered through stone, gold, incense, words, and sometimes through the careful care of an animal life. The archaeological traces of those practices still allow us to imagine a religious world in which the sacred could be near, embodied, and quietly watched over. Other temples had reputations that were tied to healing, oracular questions, or practical forms of divine help. In these settings, people did not only bring offerings for large theological reasons. They came because they were anxious, sick, uncertain, or in need of guidance. A temple linked to healing might attract those hoping for relief from bodily pain, difficult pregnancies, fever, eye trouble, or other conditions that ancient medicine could not always resolve. The god's presence was thought to be protective and restorative, and temple ritual could be part of that remedy. In oracular settings, petitioners sought answers to personal or communal questions. They might ask whether a journey should be undertaken, whether a dispute would be resolved, whether a plan had divine approval, or whether a specific action was wise. Such questions remind us that temples were not only monuments to eternal power, they were also places where daily uncertainty came into contact with sacred authority. Other sanctuaries were connected to fertility, motherhood, protection, or solar power. Some cults emphasized renewal and rebirth, while others centered on guardianship, abundance, or the daily movement of the sun across the sky. This diversity shows that temples were never all the same kind of place, even when they shared architectural forms such as courtyards, pylons, offering halls, and inner sanctuaries. The same culture could hold many devotional needs at once. A person seeking to conceive a child, a king seeking legitimacy, a family seeking safety, and a farmer hoping for sunlight and order might all turn toward temple religion, even if they did so in different ways. The temple system was broad enough to absorb these concerns. It was a framework for different kinds of hope. Festival life made these devotional centers more visible, and perhaps more emotionally immediate than the temple's usual hidden interior would suggest. Most of the time, the god's image remained within restricted sacred space, tended by priests and shielded from ordinary sight. But during festivals, the deity could emerge from the shrine and enter public view through processions, boat rituals, or ceremonial visits to other sacred places. When a god's statue left the temple, The boundary between sacred enclosure and everyday life became temporarily softer. The movement itself mattered. The divine image might be carried, rowed, or escorted through the landscape, and in that motion the god seemed to travel among the people. Ordinary worshippers could participate more directly by watching, cheering, presenting offerings, singing, or joining the path of the procession. Music, dance, incense, and spoken prayers turned the event into a shared sensory experience. Drums, sistrums, chanting, and the smell of burning resins would have created a thick atmosphere of anticipation and reverence. These moments opened a temporary passage between the hidden and the public, the official and the communal. The temple was not simply sealed away from the world, it moved through it. Such festivals also helped renew divine presence, reinforcing the idea that gods could visit, bless, and protect the human realm in active and embodied ways. They were occasions of rhythm and movement, but also of social belonging. For a short time, a great temple might feel less like a distant institution and more like a living participant in local life. Over time, some sanctuaries became pilgrimage sites for many generations, gathering layers of devotion that stretched far beyond the original moment of foundation. A place associated with a powerful god, a miracle, a healing tradition, or a famous oracle could draw visitors again and again. People came with hope, fear, gratitude, or obligation. They brought offerings of food, flowers, figurines, amulets, and written prayers. Some left formal dedications carefully carved or painted by trained hands. Others left smaller, less polished traces of their presence. These could include informal inscriptions, scratched names, short messages, or simple marks made on walls, stones, or nearby surfaces. Such graffiti may seem modest, but they are often among the most personal records surviving from the ancient world. They show that temple culture was not only a matter of royal decree or priestly ritual. Personal piety existed alongside official worship. A sanctuary could be a state institution, and at the same time, a deeply human place where an individual hoped to be noticed. Pilgrims may have returned to the same temple across years or even across generations, linking family memory to sacred geography. In that way, the temple became more than a building. It became a place where people remembered that they had once prayed, once waited, once asked for help. The written traces they left behind speak quietly across the centuries. They suggest that the temple was both grand theology and intimate need, both carefully ordered ritual and the softer, less predictable language of human longing. Archaeology has changed the way we understand Egyptian temples, because every excavation reminds us that the monuments that survive today are only fragments of something once far larger, more crowded, and more alive with ritual activity. A temple was never just the visible stone building alone. It belonged to a wider sacred landscape that might have included processional routes, storage areas, gardens, ritual lakes offering courts, workshops, priestly quarters, and approachways marked by statues or sphinxes. Over centuries, winds shifted the sand, floods altered the ground, and later builders quarried away stone. What remains can look complete at first glance, especially in photographs, but on the ground the truth is usually more complex. Walls may have collapsed, doorways may be missing, courtyards may lie beneath layers of debris, and older foundations may still rest hidden under later phases of rebuilding. In some places, archaeologists have discovered that a temple was altered so many times that one section belongs to one dynasty, another to another, and a later repair may sit neatly on top of both. The site becomes a kind of slow architectural memory, with each generation leaving a trace. Even the broken edges matter, because they can show how a temple once connected to surrounding structures now lost to time. That layered condition makes Egyptian temples feel less like frozen ruins and more like places of long continuity, where worship, maintenance, abandonment, and reuse all took place in the same ground. In a few cases, temples were once half buried by desert sand or covered by later settlements, and that burial changed their fate in unexpected ways. To the modern eye, a buried temple can seem neglected or almost forgotten, but sand can also act like a soft protective blanket. It cushions carved surfaces from constant wind, shields pigments from sunlight, and slows the erosion caused by human traffic. Some reliefs survived because they were hidden for centuries beneath dunes, only to emerge with lines still crisp and details still surprisingly readable. Other temples lay beneath villages, fields, or town edges, where later people built houses, walls, and roads directly above ancient foundations. That kind of encroachment often damaged the old structures, but it also preserved them in a paradoxical way, sealing certain elements out of sight for a long time. When excavation finally begins, the first layers removed are often not ancient at all, but traces of more recent life: pottery, ash, broken brick, and everyday debris. Then slowly the older monument begins to appear. A doorway emerges, a threshold, the edge of a courtyard. Sometimes the reveal feels almost ceremonial, as if the earth itself had been keeping a secret. Yet the process is fragile because exposure can be both rescue and risk. Once a temple is uncovered, the carvings that survived underground must now face rain, salt, heat, and the long labor of conservation. So burial may have hidden the temple from view, but it also helped preserve the voice of the stones, allowing modern researchers to hear details that would otherwise have been lost. Other temples were dismantled and reused for stone, especially in later centuries, when the practical value of cut limestone and sandstone often outweighed respect for the old religious setting. Egyptian stone was precious. It could be shaped into new walls, carried to another site, or broken down for lime kilns. In some areas, temple blocks were taken for houses, fortifications, churches, mosques, or local buildings, each reuse giving the ancient material a second life in a different era. This reuse was not always driven by hostility. Often it was simply convenience. A finely cut block is useful because someone before already did the hardest work. A column drum can become a threshold. A lintel can become a bridge piece. A carved slab can be turned inward, hidden inside a new wall where its inscription may survive unseen for centuries. To a modern observer, this can feel like loss, and in many ways it is. The original temple is reduced, its layout disturbed, its story scattered into pieces. Yet there is also something revealing in reuse, because it shows how ancient buildings remained active in memory, even when their original purpose had ended. The stone was too valuable to leave untouched. It was part of the local economy, the local landscape, and the local habit of making do with what was already there. In that sense, the survival of Egyptian temple blocks inside later constructions can be read like a second archive, one that preserves not only sacred carving, but also the practical history of everyday reuse. Scholars study temple inscriptions, block sequences, paint traces, tool marks, and orientation in order to reconstruct the original form of a site, and this work often depends on patience more than spectacle. A temple may seem silent, but the stones carry many kinds of evidence. An inscription can identify a king, a god, a ritual act, or a later repair. The order of blocks can reveal where a wall once continued before it was broken apart. Faint traces of paint may show that a pale, weathered surface was once bright blue, red, green, or gold. Tool marks can suggest whether a stone was dressed quickly or carefully, and whether the work belongs to one workshop tradition or another. Orientation matters too, because the direction of a temple might relate to the sun, the river, a local hill, or an older sacred point in the landscape. Researchers compare all of these clues slowly, often returning to the same fragments again and again as new photos, scans, and notes accumulate. A single block can alter a whole plan. A partial inscription can shift the dating of a court. A reused lintel may prove that a doorway was moved or that a room changed function. In some cases, the most important discovery is not a large statue or a famous text, but a tiny detail no bigger than a handspan. This is part of the quiet beauty of the work. Egyptian temples are often treated as grand monuments, but their histories are assembled from small, almost delicate observations. The scholars who study them are reading in a language of fragments, and each fragment has the power to reshape the story. Modern restoration has also been important, though it brings its own challenges, because every decision made in the present affects how the temple will be seen in the future. Conservators must decide how much to clean, how much to stabilize, and how much to rebuild. A surface covered in dust or salt may need gentle treatment, but too much cleaning can erase traces of age or damage the original finish. Loose walls may need support, but reinforcement should not create a false image of what the building once looked like. Missing sections may be reconstructed in limited ways, yet any reconstruction must balance clarity with honesty. The aim is usually to protect what remains while respecting the temple's long history and complexity. That may mean leaving some breaks visible, rather than trying to make the monument look new. It may mean using modern materials in discreet ways, or recording every intervention so future researchers can understand what was original and what was added later. These are not simple choices. They involve archaeology, engineering, ethics, and an almost patient kind of humility. A temple is not just being repaired for the present moment, it is being cared for across time. Each intervention becomes part of its biography. The work may be invisible to a casual visitor, but that invisibility is often intentional. The best conservation can feel like restraint, allowing the ancient surface to remain itself while quietly giving it a longer life. For visitors, Egyptian temples often feel both monumental and incomplete, and that combination creates a distinctive kind of silence. One may walk through towering gates, stand before enormous columns, or trace reliefs that still show processions of priests and offerings, yet still feel the emptiness where roofs once covered the space, where painted ritual scenes once glowed in lamplight, or where statues once stood in niches. That feeling of incompleteness is not a flaw. It is part of the temple's power. The broken edges, the open sky, and the weathered stone invite the imagination to continue what is missing. A visitor does not merely observe the monument, they sense its absence. The temple seems to speak, but in damaged sentences. A carved hymn may survive without the building that once framed it. A sacred courtyard may remain without the sound of footsteps it once held. The ruins become most moving when one realizes that their emptiness is not empty at all, but full of vanished movement, ceremony, chanting, and attention. The stillness of the place is deepened by the knowledge that so much happened there. In this way, Egyptian temples can feel especially dreamlike at dawn or late afternoon, when the light is soft and the shadows stretch across the stone. The brokenness invites slow attention, and slow attention becomes its own kind of reverence. There is no need to rush. The site reveals itself in parts, and perhaps that is fitting for a place shaped by centuries of loss and survival. The scholarly process itself becomes a kind of quiet ritual, repeated with care at site after site. Measuring, photographing, recording, comparing, and publishing may sound ordinary, yet together they create a discipline of attention that resembles a form of service. Archaeologists often move carefully through a temple not only to gather information, but to avoid disturbing what still remains. A tape measure is stretched, a wall is drawn, a block is numbered, a fragment is catalogued, a photograph is taken in the right light, sometimes at dawn or in the late afternoon when carved details appear more clearly. Then the notes are compared with earlier reports, maps, and photographs, allowing old assumptions to be tested against new evidence. This work is slow and it can feel repetitive, but repetition is part of the method. A temple is understood through accumulation, not haste. In some ways, the site is being listened to by many generations of researchers, each adding a small piece to the record. The results may take years to publish, and even then the interpretation can change as new discoveries are made. Yet this careful labor matters because it restores meaning to places that might otherwise be reduced to scenery. Without documentation, a ruin can be admired and then forgotten. With documentation, it remains part of historical conversation. The measurements, drawings, and reports become a living record, a way of keeping faith with the monument's complexity. In this sense, archaeology acts almost like another kind of temple service. Ancient priests once tended sacred spaces through cleaning, offering, recitation, and repair. Their work kept the divine house orderly, renewed, and properly oriented toward the cosmic world it was meant to reflect. Modern scholars do not reenact that religion, but they do perform a related act of care. They clear away layers of misunderstanding. They stabilize danger before it leads to collapse. They record what is visible so that future damage does not erase it completely. They study the remains with patience, acknowledging that the temple's story is larger than any one excavation season. That ongoing care can feel solemn, almost devotional in its attentiveness, even though it is grounded in science and history rather than ritual belief. The goal is not to restore the temple to a lost perfection, because such a thing no longer exists. The goal is to tend the remains so that history is not entirely lost to silence. In that work there is a quiet dignity. The stones do not need to be made whole in order to matter. Their fragments still hold memory. Their edges still speak. And when handled with respect, they continue to offer something enduring, a place where the past remains present gently in the breath of the open air. The afterlife of Egyptian temples has been long and varied, and in that long afterlife, the buildings themselves changed almost as much as the cultures that came to look at them. Some sanctuaries remained active well into late antiquity, continuing to receive offerings, processions, and repairs long after the world that first raised them had begun to shift. Others slowly fell silent, their chambers emptied of ritual but not of meaning. Walls that once heard chants and footfalls became surfaces for wind and sand. In time, they were visited by travelers, scholars, and later artists, each of whom tried in a different way to understand what he or she had seen. The Greek and Roman worlds admired Egyptian sanctuaries, though often through their own assumptions, reading them as ancient, mysterious, and almost impossibly old. In later centuries, explorers, antiquarians, and archaeologists added new layers of interpretation, some careful and some not, and the temples continue to gather meanings as steadily as they once gathered incense. There is something quietly moving about that long continuity of attention. A temple does not cease to matter simply because its rites have ended. It can become a ruin and still remain a presence in the landscape, a shape against the sky, a memory in stone. For some visitors, the attraction was visual, the severe beauty of columns and pylons and carved reliefs. For others, it was intellectual, a puzzle to be solved through inscriptions, measurements, and comparison. For many, it was simply the feeling of standing before something that had survived so much time. Even when the original voice of the temple was no longer audible, its silence was full of suggestions. The worn edges of reliefs, the faded traces of color, the broken thresholds, and the buried courts all hinted at former grandeur without needing to say it aloud. Today, many Egyptian temples are protected heritage sites, studied as both art and history. They are examined with tools that ancient builders could never have imagined, and yet they still speak in their own original language of scale, proportion, and stone. Tourists from around the world walk through them every day, but even in a crowd, many temples keep an unexpected intimacy. Their surfaces absorb sound. Their halls stretch the voice. A person can stand beneath a massive lintel and feel, for a moment, as if the structure has created a private pocket of air around them. Light moves slowly across carved scenes, revealing one detail and then another. A painted line appears and disappears with the angle of the sun. What looks hard and permanent from a distance can feel delicate when seen up close, as if the whole building were still adjusting itself to the passing hours. That quiet atmosphere is part of why the temples continue to fascinate. They were never merely decorative monuments. They were places where human work tried to reach beyond itself. Each stone block, each column, each painted offering scene was the result of practical labor joined to sacred intention. In Egypt, the temple lasted for a very long time because it was supported by a whole social world. Builders shaped the masonry, farmers supplied grain, boatmen carried stone, timber, and people along the river, priests organized the routines of purification and offering, musicians marked festivals, scribes recorded deliveries, donations, and temple property. Cleaners, cooks, and craftsmen kept daily life moving. The grandeur of the temple rested on many quiet hands, many of them unnamed in the surviving records. Their labor, repeated and often invisible, was part of the holy order itself. And that is one reason the temples feel so complete even now. They embody the joining of material and idea. A temple could not float above the world. It depended on the land around it, on the fields, the quarries, the river, and the seasons. It was fed by the same agricultural rhythms that sustained the villages and towns nearby. At the same time, it stood apart from ordinary life, defining a sacred boundary where the daily and the divine met in carefully arranged form. This balance between the practical and the ceremonial gives Egyptian temples their special force. They are not abstract ideals made visible. They are earthly structures filled with signs of transcendence, precision, and patience. When you imagine these temples at their height, it helps to picture them not as empty monuments but as living environments. Imagine the slow opening of a court at dawn, when the first light touched sandstone still cool from the night. Imagine water carried for cleansing, incense prepared in small bowls, and the subtle scent of resin rising into a shaded hall. Imagine priests moving in measured steps, their words spoken carefully, their gestures repeated according to old instruction. Imagine the gleam of paint on stone, brighter than it appears today, and the soft shadow cast by columns standing in long rows. In such a place, time would not have felt entirely ordinary. It would have been measured by ritual, by the arrival of the sun, by festival calendars, and by the turning of the year. A temple's later history adds another layer to that feeling. As religions changed, some sanctuaries were repurposed, dismantled, or abandoned. Stones were reused in other buildings. Walls were covered, cut through, or toppled. Yet even as these changes happened, the temples retained a kind of stubborn visibility. Their outline remained on the horizon. Their carved names remained in the stone. Their gods were remembered in stories, if not in worship. Travelers from the classical world saw them and tried to explain them through familiar frameworks, comparing Egyptian practice with their own traditions. Medieval and early modern observers often approached the ruins with wonder mixed with confusion. Some treated them as treasure houses of wisdom. Others saw them as relics of a remote and unknowable past. In each era, the temples held still while interpretation moved around them. Modern archaeology has given the temples yet another life. Careful study has revealed traces of construction phases, repairs, paint layers, inscriptions, and hidden spaces. What once looked simple has become more complex. A single wall might carry evidence of many centuries of use. A doorway might show signs of reopening, blocking, or ritual adaptation. A temple that appears complete from afar may in fact have been altered repeatedly, its meaning revised by successive generations. Scholars continue to debate dates, functions, and local traditions because Egyptian temples were never all built to one pattern. They were similar enough to be recognized, but varied enough to resist easy generalization. This uncertainty is part of their charm. It leaves room for careful thought and for quiet admiration of what survives. The temples also remind us that sacred architecture is never only about the gods. It is about order, hierarchy, and the shaping of space. In Egypt, that order extended from the outer world of public approach to the inner sanctum where divine presence was imagined to dwell. The movement inward was often a narrowing of light and access. Broad courts gave way to smaller halls, and those in turn led to ever more restricted chambers. The experience of entering was therefore both physical and symbolic. One left the open brightness of the river world and entered a more controlled atmosphere, one of shadow, polish, inscription, and stillness. Such a journey could feel solemn, even when crowded with ceremony, because the architecture itself directed the body and the mind toward focus. At the same time, the temples were not sealed away from the rest of Egypt. They were woven into the economy and into local life. Their estates owned land. Their storerooms held grain, oil, linen, and beer. Their workshops produced objects for ritual use and maintenance. Their festivals drew crowds. A temple could become a temporary center of communal celebration, with music, feasting, and processions opening the otherwise enclosed sacred order to wider participation. In that sense, temples were both exclusive and inclusive. Certain rooms were reserved for priests and sacred objects, but the temple as an institution touched many people who never entered the innermost chambers. It touched them through employment, through taxation, through seasonal ritual, and through the shared rhythm of the calendar. The gods themselves were part of that rhythm. Egyptian temples were not built to house a distant deity in the modern sense, but to provide a place where divine presence could be renewed and sustained. Offerings, hymns, and ritual care were ways of maintaining cosmic balance. The temple was thus a working model of the world as Egyptians understood it, ordered, maintained, and vulnerable to disorder if neglected. That belief gave practical importance to even the smallest actions. A clean floor, a correctly tied knot, a measured libation, a spoken name all mattered. The precision of temple life was not a matter of empty formality. It was a form of participation in the stability of creation itself. This helps explain why the temples still feel emotionally resonant even when their original beliefs are far away from the modern visitor. Their architecture expresses a deep human desire to make order visible. Massive stone walls suggest endurance. Symmetry suggests balance. Repeated columns suggest rhythm. Carved inscriptions preserve names and formulas that were meant to last. The whole structure seems to say that permanence can be approached, if not fully achieved, through care and repetition. That message is perhaps why temples continue to draw people who may not know every historical detail but still feel the calm gravity of the place. And yet the temples are not frozen in one moment. They are remnants, but they are also continuities. They connect landscapes to gods, kings to craftsmen, calendars to stars, and memory to architecture. They point in many directions at once, to the river that sustained them, to the quarries that supplied them, to the priests who maintained them, to the artists who painted them, and to the later generations who copied, measured, and protected them. Their survival is uneven and incomplete, yet even in ruin they remain legible as acts of extraordinary human intention. One can see in them the effort to make a durable form for what is fleeting: breath, praise, season, rain, and life itself. Perhaps that is why the temples continue to invite slow attention. They do not demand urgency, they reward a steady gaze. A visitor can spend a long time looking at a single relief, a single column, or a single chipped inscription and still not exhaust the place. The stone keeps its own pace. Shadows move, birds pass overhead, heat gathers and thins. Somewhere nearby, the modern world continues with traffic, conversation, and commerce, yet the temple remains settled in another register of time. It does not hurry, it remembers. So when you think of Egyptian temples, imagine not only their size but their patience. Imagine the sound of sandals on stone, the coolness of interior halls, the faint scent of dust warmed by sun, and the gold of late afternoon touching worn reliefs. Imagine a place where labor became devotion, where architecture became memory, and where the repeated acts of many generations built something larger than any single life. The temples of Egypt endure as monuments, but also as witnesses. They hold the traces of those who made them, served them, repaired them, observed them, and reimagined them. And in that deep layering of use and meaning, there is a kind of lasting peace. And so our slow walk through the temples of Egypt comes to a quiet close. If you are drifting toward sleep now, let the image remain simple: warm stone, softened shadows, and the long patience of ancient walls under the desert night. Thank you for spending this time here. May the rest of your night be calm and unhurried,